Okay, so we're going to go back in time because to understand so many of the conflicts today, you really have to grasp this one single violent turning point. It happened in 1 week in August 1929, and it completely shattered centuries of coexistence, redrawing the map of relationships in ways whose echoes are, well, they're still being felt right now.
And look, those aren't my words. That's the official finding from the British government's investigation right after the events of August 1929. Ferocious and unspeakable savagery. I mean, that's the level of horror we're talking about, and it's the historical mystery we really need to unpack.
And the absolute epicenter of that savagery was the ancient city of Hebron. This was a place where Jews had lived, prayed, and been buried for literally thousands of years.
The raw numbers here are just staggering. In only a few hours on August 24th, 67 Jews were slaughtered. But the most profound fact here, the one that really hits you, is what that third bullet point represents. An ancient community, one that had been there for millennia, was just gone, wiped out in a single day. This wasn't a battle. It was the complete annihilation of a neighborhood.
So that brings us to this central question for this whole explainer, right? How does this happen? How do people who have lived as neighbors for generations suddenly turn on each other with that kind of fury? Well, the answer isn't just in the events of that single day. It's really in the centuries that led up to it. To really get the foundation of their relationship, we've got to go back to the long era of Islamic rule, where there was this very specific system that governed how Jews and Muslims lived together. Now, it was never about equality. It was about a clearly defined and often pretty stable hierarchy. And the crucial concept here is something called dhimmi. For centuries, this was the legal status for Jews and Christians. It was essentially a deal. You get to run your own community, you can practice your religion, and your property is protected. But in exchange, you have to pay a special tax, the jizya, and you have to formally accept your status as a subordinate community. This slide, I think, perfectly shows the two sides of that coin. On one hand, yeah, you've got real protections, safety, religious freedom, self-governance. But on the other hand, you have very explicit restrictions, and they were all designed to reinforce that you were in a secondary position. It was a framework for coexistence, for sure, but it was absolutely not a framework for equality.
And the Jewish community that lived inside this system for all that time is what we now call the Old Yishuv. These were deeply religious people, often speaking Arabic or Ladino, and their entire focus was on faith and religious study, not on gaining political power. They were just part of the local fabric of the land for centuries.
But then, the 19th century happens, and the ground just starts to shift under everyone's feet. You've got two very different worlds, one ancient and religious, the other modern and nationalist, and they begin to collide right here in this small patch of land, setting the stage for a massive conflict. So first, just look at this population boom. This is even before the rise of modern political Zionism. You've got religious Jews moving to the Holy Land in really large numbers. So much so that by 1880, Jews were actually the largest single community in Jerusalem. And this was the old Yishuv growing from within, a religious phenomenon, not a political one. But then a totally different group starts to arrive, the new Yishuv. And wow, this slide just lays out the massive chasm between them. The old community was religious, they were apolitical. The new pioneers, they were secular and fiercely nationalist. The old Yishuv was waiting for a divine Messiah. The new Yishuv wanted to create a political state with their own hands through their own labor. They were two completely different worlds, and honestly, they were often very suspicious of each other. At the exact same time, another huge change is happening, this time with the land itself. The Ottoman Empire, trying to modernize, passes a new land law. And it had this massive, unintended consequence. It suddenly made it much easier for large, wealthy landlords, who often lived far away, to buy up huge areas of land from small farmers. So take a look at who ended up selling that land. See that biggest slice? Over half the land bought by Zionist organizations came from large absentee landlords, many of whom didn't even live in Palestine. Now, while direct sales from small farmers were pretty rare, the result on the ground was often the same. Tenant farmers who had worked that land for generations were now being displaced, and this became a major source of friction. Okay, so you've got these social and economic tensions just simmering. And then, after World War I, a political accelerant gets thrown right onto the fire. The Ottoman Empire collapses, the British arrive, and with them come two competing and, as it turned out, totally irreconcilable promises.
In 1917, Britain issues the Balfour Declaration. And this is huge. For the very first time, a major world power gives official backing to the Zionist goal of a national home. For the new Yishuv, this was a monumental political victory.
You see, the entire British mandate was basically built on a contradiction. Their job was to build a national home for the Jewish minority, while also protecting the rights of the Arab majority who, after being promised independence from the Ottomans, felt completely and profoundly betrayed. It was an impossible, irreconcilable situation right from day one.
And all of this tension found its flashpoint at Jerusalem's Western Wall. For centuries, a really delicate status quo existed there, but now every little action was seen as a play for national sovereignty. It all started with a dispute over a prayer screen. Then, in August 1929, a nationalist Jewish youth group marches at the wall with a flag, a clear symbol of new political aspirations, and it's seen as a major provocation. An Arab counter-protest follows. Then, rumors start flying that Jews are attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and on August 23rd, the whole city just explodes. Which brings us right back to that explosion of 1929. But now, hopefully, we can see all the forces that lit the fuse. And now we can start to understand the profound and lasting consequences of that explosion.
The human cost across the country was just devastating. 133 Jews were killed in the riots. 116 Arabs were also killed, but the vast majority of them by British police and soldiers who were trying to restore order.
The impact was immediate, and it was irreversible. The Hebron community was gone. Its survivors were evacuated by the British. For the Zionist leaders, this was definitive proof that the British couldn't protect them. It also shattered any lingering socialist dreams that Jewish and Arab workers might unite. The conflict was now stripped bare. It was a zero-sum struggle between two national movements.
And this, right here, this is the ultimate takeaway. The 1929 riots, and especially the Hebron Massacre, became a strategic turning point. The lesson the Zionist leadership took away from this was that survival depended entirely on self-reliance. This led directly to them strengthening their underground defense force, the Haganah, which would one day become the Israeli army. The old world of coexistence was dead, and a new, much more militarized era had just begun.
So where does that leave us? We're left with this question.
The tragedy of 1929, it wasn't the beginning of the story, but it was the violent end of one chapter and the start of a brand new one. And knowing this history of ancient communities, of colliding ideologies, and of this single catastrophic event, it forces us to look at everything that came after not as a simple story of right and wrong, but as a deeply complex legacy of trauma and transformation.